The Kayapo rain ritual, a shaman who walked across the river without sinking. Amazon Bison. The year 1933 brought with it a curse that the Kayapo people had not witnessed in 3 generations. The mighty Singo River, which had always been the lifeblood of their territory, had retreated to a mere trickle of its former self. Where once the waters rushed with the force of 1,000 spirits, now only cracked earth and exposed riverbed stones remained, baking under the relentless Amazonians. In the village of Metuptider, nestled deep within the emerald embrace of the rainforest, Chief Raoni stood at the edge of what had once been the riverbank. His weathered face, marked by decades of wisdom and the intricate patterns of traditional Kayapo body paint, reflected the gravity of their situation. The drought had persisted for 7 moons, longer than any elder could remember, and the very survival of his people hung in the balance. The village, typically alive with the sounds of children playing and women preparing manioc, had fallen into an uneasy silence. The usual abundance of fish that provided sustenance for the community had vanished with the receding waters. The forest, though still green, showed signs of stress. Even the great cecropia trees, with their broad leaves that usually caught the morning dew, seemed to droop with thirst. Young mothers clutched their infants closer, their eyes reflecting the fear that dared not speak its name. The elderly sat in the shade of their traditional thatched homes, their voices reduced to whispers as they spoke of omens and the displeasure of the spirits. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything to break the spell that had befallen their land. It was during this time of desperation that the village turned its collective gaze toward Pahe Kumare, the most powerful shaman their people had known in living memory. Kumare was not like other shamans. His connection to the spirit world was so profound that even the most skeptical among the Kayapo spoke of him with reverence bordering on awe. Stories of his abilities had spread far beyond their territory, reaching other indigenous communities throughout the Amazon Basin. Born during a rare lunar eclipse, 43 years prior, Kumare had shown signs of his extraordinary gifts from childhood. As a boy, he could predict the arrival of jaguars days before they appeared near the village. He spoke with the voices of ancestral spirits during his sleep, delivering messages that proved uncannily accurate. By the time he reached manhood, his reputation as a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds was unquestioned. The shaman's dwelling stood apart from the main village, positioned at a sacred grove where the forest spirits were said to gather during the full moon. It was here that Chief Raoni found himself walking as the sun reached its zenith on what would prove to be a day that would forever change the destiny of his people. Kumare emerged from his hut before the chief could announce his presence, as if the shaman had been expecting this visit. The holy man's appearance was striking even by Kayapo standards. His body was adorned with intricate geometric patterns painted in red urucum and black genipapo, designs that seemed to shift and dance in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. His magnificent headdress, crafted from the brilliant feathers of toucans, macaws, and harpy eagles, caught the light like a crown of living fire. "The spirits have been restless," Kumare said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "They speak of a great imbalance, a wound in the harmony between our world and theirs. The drought is not merely a lack of rain, it is a sign that we have forgotten the old ways, the sacred contracts our ancestors made with the forces that govern water and sky." Chief Raoni nodded gravely. "They have suspected as much. In recent years, contact with the outside world had increased. Robber tappers and explorers had penetrated deeper into their territory, bringing with them strange ideas and disrupting ancient patterns of life. Some of the Ajamjar Kayapo had begun to question the old traditions, attracted by the metal tools and colorful cloth offered by these outsiders. "What must we do, Pahe?" the chief asked, using the respectful term for shaman. "Our children grow weak, and the forest itself seems to be dying. The spirits of our ancestors must be crying out for us to act." Kumare closed his eyes and tilted his head, as if listening to voices only he could hear. When he opened them again, they held a tenderness that sent shivers down the chief's spine. "There is a way," the shaman said slowly, but it will require a demonstration of faith that has not been attempted in many generations. The spirits demand proof that we still honor the ancient pacts. They want to see that our connection to the sacred remains unbroken. The chief waited, sensing that whatever Kumare was about to propose would test the very foundations of their beliefs. I must perform the ritual of walking waters, the shaman continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. It is written in the songs of our ancestors that in times of great need, a true servant of the spirits can walk upon the surface of water as if it were solid ground. But this is not mere magic, it is a covenant, a demonstration of absolute trust between the shaman and the forces that govern our world. Chief Raoni felt his breath catch in his throat. He heard whispers of such rituals in the most ancient stories, tales so old that they seemed more like myths than historical accounts. The idea that someone could actually walk on water seemed impossible, yet he had witnessed Kumare perform feats that defied explanation. The ritual must be performed at the place where our sacred river meets the Great Bend, Kumare explained, referring to a location several miles downstream where the Singo covered dramatically around a massive boulder formation. There, where the water spirits are strongest, I will call upon them to demonstrate their power and our people's worthiness. As the two men spoke, word of their conversation began to spread throughout the village with the speed of wildfire. By evening, every member of the community knew that their shaman intended to attempt something that existed only in legend. Some expressed excitement and hope, while others worried that such hubris might anger the spirits further. That night, as the village settled into an uneasy sleep, Kumare began his preparations. The ritual would require 3 days of purification, during which he would fast, consume only sacred plants, and commune with the spirits through meditation and ceremonial chanting. The very air around his dwelling seemed to thicken with spiritual energy as he began this process. Meanwhile, Chief Raoni sent runners to neighboring Kayapo villages, inviting them to witness what might be either a miracle or a catastrophe. Word spread quickly through the forest, telegraph of drums and smoke signals, and by the second day, representatives from distant communities had begun arriving in Metuktir. Among those who came was an old woman named Irasema, a respected keeper of oral traditions from a village 3 days' journey to the north. She had lived through 93 seasons and claimed to be the last person alive who had heard first-hand accounts of the walking waters ritual from her own grandmother. It has been attempted only twice in our recorded history, she told the gathered crowd on the evening before the ceremony. The first time, during the great flood of our great-grandfather's time, the shaman succeeded and saved our people from drowning. The second time, during a drought much like this one, the shaman's faith was found wanting, and he sank beneath the waters, never to be seen again. Her words cast a sobering shadow over the anticipation that had been building. The ritual was not merely a demonstration of power. It was a test that could cost Kumare his life. As the third day dawned, the shaman emerged from his period of purification transformed. His usual robust frame had been refined by fasting into something that seemed almost ethereal. His eyes held a depth that suggested he had journeyed to realms beyond ordinary human experience. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in the chest of every listener. Today, he announced to the assembled crowd, we will learn whether the spirits still recognize us as their children, or whether we have strayed so far from the sacred path that we are no longer worthy of their protection. The procession toward the ritual site began at sunrise, with Kumare leading the way, followed by Chief Raoni and the village elders, and finally the entire community stretching out in a long line through the forest. The journey would take most of the morning, and with each step, the tension grew thicker than the humid air that surrounded them. As they walked, the sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the very jungle was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Even the ever-present chorus of insects and birds had fallen silent, creating an atmosphere of expectancy that was almost overwhelming. The sacred bend of the Singo River, when they finally reached it, presented a sight that reinforced the magnitude of what Kumare was attempting. Despite the drought, This section of the river still held water, though it was much lower than normal. The current here was known to be treacherous, even in the best of times, with hidden rocks and sudden depth changes that had claimed the lives of experienced swimmers. As the community gathered on the riverbank, arranging themselves in a great semicircle that would allow everyone to witness the ceremony, Kumare began the final phase of his preparation. The ritual itself would be unlike anything most of them had ever seen, a culmination of spiritual practice that would either vindicate their faith or shatter it forever. As the morning sun climbed higher above the Amazon canopy, the sacred bend of the Singre River became the focal point of what would later be remembered as one of the most significant spiritual events in Kayapo history. Representatives from 7 different villages had arrived overnight, their canoes pulled up along the muddy banks like a fleet of wooden prayers. The gathering represented the largest assembly of Kayapo people in recent memory, united by desperation and hope in equal measure. Among the witnesses was Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German anthropologist who had been living with a neighboring tribe for the past 8 months, documenting indigenous customs for the Berlin Museum of Ethnology. Word of the extraordinary ritual had reached him through the complex network of intertribal communication, and he had traveled for 2 days through treacherous jungle terrain to observe what he initially dismissed as elaborate theater designed to impress an outsider. Zimmermann positioned himself at the edge of the gathering, his camera and notebook ready to document what he expected would be an interesting example of shamanic performance art. His academic skepticism, however, began to waver as he observed the profound solemnity with which the Kayapo approached the ceremony. This was clearly not a show for his benefit. It was a sacred act of desperate faith. The anthropologist's presence had initially caused some concern among the tribal elders, but Kumare himself had welcomed the outsider's attendance. Let the white man witness, the shaman had said. Perhaps his people need to remember that there are forces in this world that cannot be measured with their instruments or explained by their books. As the crowd settled into position along the riverbank, the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. Children who normally could not sit still for more than a few minutes remained motionless beside their parents, instinctively understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Even the youngest seemed to sense that this moment would become part of the stories they would tell their own children decades hence. Elder Takak, the oldest man in attendance at 97 years, had been carried to the ceremony on a litter borne by 4 young warriors. His presence lent additional gravity to the proceedings, as he was widely regarded as the living repository of Kayapo wisdom and tradition. When he spoke, which was rarely, entire villages listened. "I have seen many shamans in my long life," Takak whispered to those gathered near him, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "But Kumare carries within him something I have not witnessed since I was a boy. There is a light in his spirit that burns brighter than the others. Today we will learn if that light is strong enough to illuminate the path between worlds." The ritual site itself had been carefully prepared according to ancient protocol. 4 large stones, each representing one of the cardinal directions, had been placed in the shallow water near the shore. Between them, intricate patterns had been drawn in the sand, with colored clay and crushed minerals, creating a mandala-like design that seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm. Kumare stood at the center of this sacred geometry, his magnificent feathered headdress catching the morning light like a beacon. His body paint, applied fresh that morning, told the story of his spiritual lineage through symbols that had been passed down through countless generations. Each line, each dot, each geonetic pattern carried meaning that connected him to the shamans who had come before, and the spirits they served. The ceremony began with the lighting of sacred fires at each of the 4 cardinal points. The smoke from these fires, fed with specific combinations of aromatic woods and medicinal plants, rose straight up into the still air, creating pillars that seemed to connect earth and sky. The scent was unlike anything that Zimmermann had encountered, complex, otherworldly, and somehow alive with possibility. As the fires burned, Kumare began to chant in the ancient language of the spirits, words so old that even many of the Kayapo elders could not fully understand their meaning. The chant started as a low rumble, barely distinguishable from the sound of distant thunder, but gradually grew in volume and complexity until it seemed to fill the entire river valley. The effect on the assembled crowd was immediate and profound. Bodies began to sway in rhythm with the chant, and several of the other shamans present began to add their voices to the growing chorus. The sound built layer upon layer, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the very bones of those who heard it. But Zimmerman found himself struggling to maintain his scientific attachment as the chanting continued, despite his rational mind insistence that he was merely observing an elaborate cultural performance. Something deeper within him responded to the primal power of the ceremony. His hands, which had been steadily taking notes, began to tremble slightly, and he found it increasingly difficult to focus on his academic observations. Young Aritana, the chief's son and heir apparent, stood near the front of the gathering, with his eyes fixed on Kumare. At 19, it represented the new generation of Kayapo, who had been exposed to outside influences and modern ideas. Yet as he watched the shaman's preparations, he felt a connection to his ancestral heritage that was stronger than any doubt or skepticism. "Do you truly believe he can do it?" whispered Kretire, Aritana's closest friend and hunting companion. The question hung in the air between them, representing the internal struggle that many of the younger Kayapo were experiencing. Aritana was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I have seen Kumare call rain from clear skies and heal wounds that should have been fatal," he said finally. "If anyone can walk upon water, it is he. But more than that, I believe our people need to see that the old ways still have power. We need to remember who we are." As the chanting reached its crescendo, Kumare began to move toward the water's edge. His steps were measured and deliberate, each one placed with the precision of a dancer, following choreography written in the star. The crowd fell silent as he approached the river, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the crackling of the sacred fires. The shaman paused at the very edge of the water, his toes touching the muddy bank where solid ground met liquid uncertainty. For a moment it seemed to stretch into eternity. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed and his arms raised toward the sky. Those watching could see his lips moving in silent prayer, though no sound emerged. Dr. Zimmerman raised his camera, his finger poised over the shutter release. Whatever was about to happen, he was determined to document it. Yet as he looked through the viewfinder, he noticed something that made him lower the camera in confusion. The air around Kumare seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. Despite the relatively cool morning temperature, Elder Takak leaned forward on his litter, his ancient eyes straining to see every detail of what was unfolding before him. "The spirits are gathering," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I can feel them moving in the air like invisible birds." Indeed, there was something happening that transcended normal sensory experience. Several of the more spiritually sensitive individuals in the crowd began to report strange sensations, a tingling in their skin, a sense of presence that seemed to surround them, and an almost musical quality to the air itself that existed just below the threshold of hearing. Kumare opened his eyes, and those closest to him gasped at what they saw. The shaman's pupils had dilated until they were almost entirely black, and within that darkness seemed to swirl depths that suggested he was looking into realms far beyond the physical world. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "Spirits of the water, guardians of the sacred flow, I call upon you to witness the faith of your children," he intoned, his words carrying across the water with supernatural clarity. "We have not forgotten the ancient covenants. We have not abandoned the sacred ways. Show us that you still recognize us as your own." The response was immediate and unmistakable. The water before Kumare began to change, its surface becoming mirror smooth despite the gentle current that had been visible moments before. The reflection of the sky in the water became so perfect that it was difficult to tell where reality ended and reflection began. Several people in the crowd began to weep, overwhelmed by the spiritual intensity of the moment. Others fell to their knees, recognizing that they were witnessing something that existed at the very intersection of faith and reality. Even Zimmerman found himself holding his breath, his scientific skepticism crumbling in the face of something that defied rational explanation. Kumare raised his right foot and placed it on the surface of the water. The moment Kumare's foot touched the water's surface, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. What should have been a splash, a natural breaking of the surface tension that would send ripples across the river, instead produced something that defied every law of physics that Zimmerman had ever studied. The shaman's foot rested upon the water as if it were solid ground, creating only the faintest depression in the liquid surface, like a footprint in soft clay. A collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd, followed by an almost supernatural silence. Even the ever-present sounds of the Amazon, the calling of birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of howler monkeys seemed to fade into nothingness. It was as if the entire rainforest had paused to witness this impossible moment. Zimmerman's hands shook as he raised his camera, his academic mind struggling to process what his eyes were clearly seeing. Through the viewfinder, he could see Kumare standing with one foot on the muddy riverbank and the other resting impossibly on the water's surface. The image was so surreal that for a moment he wondered if he was experiencing some form of hallucination brought on by the exotic plants burning in the sacred fires. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The shaman was supporting part of his weight on water that behaved as if it had suddenly acquired the properties of solid matter. The surface beneath his foot showed no signs of breaking or giving way, maintaining its integrity in a manner that violated everything. Zimmerman understood about the physical world. Young Aritana felt tears streaming down his face, though he was unaware of crying. The sight before him connected him to something primal and ancient within his soul, a recognition that he was witnessing the manifestation of powers that his ancestors had always claimed existed, but which the modern world insisted were mere superstition. "The spirits accept him," whispered Elder Takak, his voice filled with wonder despite his advanced age and extensive experience with shamanic practices. "I have lived nearly a century, and I have never seen the water spirits grant such favor to a mortal man." Kumare remained motionless for several heartbeats, allowing the reality of what was happening to settle over the gathering. His face showed no surprise or triumph, only a profound serenity that suggested he had headed nothing less than this miraculous response to his faith. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the water with preternatural clarity. "Behold the power of the ancient covenant," he said, his words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The spirits remember what we have forgotten. They honor what we have abandoned. Today, they remind us that the boundary between possible and impossible exists only in minds that have lost their connection to the sacred." With deliberate slowness, Kumare lifted his other foot from the muddy bank and placed it on the water beside the first. Now he stood completely on the river's surface, his full weight supported by liquid that had somehow acquired the properties of solid ground. The sight was so extraordinary that several members of the crowd fell to their knees in spontaneous worship. Zimmerman's camera clicked repeatedly as he documented the impossible scene, though part of him wondered if the photographs would show anything at all, or if this was the kind of miracle that could only be witnessed, never captured. His scientific training demanded that he look for explanations, hidden platforms, optical illusions, mass hypnosis, but his eyes could find no evidence of trickery. The water beneath Kumare's feet remained perfectly clear, allowing everyone to see that there was nothing solid supporting him, except the river itself. Fish swam beneath the surface, their movements visibly through the transparent water, passing directly under the shaman's feet, as if he were standing on invisible glass. How is this possible? Kretide whispered to Aritana, his voice barely audible in the profound silence that had settled over the gathering. Perhaps, Aritana replied softly, the question is not how, but why. The spirits are showing us that the old ways still have power, that our ancestors' knowledge was not mere superstition, but a deeper understanding of the world's true nature. As if responding to the young man's words, Kumare began to move. His first step across the water's surface created a sensation that rippled through the crowd, like an electric shock. The shaman walked with the same measured pace he might use on solid ground, each footfall creating only the slightest depression in the water's surface before returning to its normal level. The sight was so mesmerizing that many in the crowd found themselves swaying in rhythm with the shaman's steps, as if his movement across the water was creating some form of hypnotic resonance. The sacred fires continued to burn at the cardinal points, their smoke rising straight up into the still air like pillars connecting earth and heaven. With each step Kumare took, the spiritual intensity of the moment seemed to increase. Several of the other shamans present began to chant softly, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to support and amplify the miracle unfolding before them. The sound was unlike anything Zimmerman had ever heard, not quite music, not quite prayer, but something that combined elements of both into something entirely transcendent. As the shaman reached the center of the river, he paused and raised his arms toward the sky. The gesture seemed to trigger a response from the natural world itself. A gentle breeze began to blow, carrying with it the scent of rain despite the cloudless sky. The water around Kumare's feet began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light that had no apparent source. "The spirits are dancing," whispered one of the elderly women in the crowd, her voice filled with awe. "I can see them moving in the light around his feet." Indeed, there seemed to be shapes moving within the luminescence, forms that suggested the presence of beings that existed beyond the normal range of human perception. The light pulsed in rhythm, with Kumare's heartbeat, creating patterns that were beautiful beyond description, yet somehow alien to ordinary human experience. Dr. Zimmerman found himself struggling to maintain his role as an objective observer. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was witnessing an elaborate hoax or experiencing some form of collective delusion. But the evidence of his senses was overwhelming. The shaman was walking on water, and the water was responding to his presence in ways that defied every scientific principle he had ever learned. As Kumare continued his journey across the river, the crowd began to follow his progress along the shoreline, maintaining their position as witnesses to this unprecedented demonstration of spiritual power. Children who had been silent with awe began to point and whisper excitedly, their young minds more readily accepting the miraculous than their elders' more skeptical perspective. The shaman's movement across the water was not merely a display of supernatural ability, it was a form of prayer in motion, a conversation between the human and divine realms that was being conducted through the medium of impossible physics. Each step seemed to strengthen the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds, creating a bridge that allowed the sacred to manifest in the realm of the ordinary. Halfway across the river, Kumare stopped and turned to face the assembled crowd. His eyes, which had been focused on some distant point beyond the physical horizon, now met the gaze of his people with an intensity that seemed to look directly into their souls. "Do you see?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the water despite the distance. "Do you understand what the spirits are teaching us? The drought is not a punishment, it is a test. They wanted to know if we still possessed the faith of our ancestors, if we still believed in the power of the sacred covenant." As he spoke, clouds began to gather in the sky above, appearing with a suddenness that was as miraculous as the shaman's water walking. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain, and the first drops began to fall just as Kumare resumed his journey toward the far shore. The timing was so perfect that even Dr. Zimmerman had to acknowledge that either he was witnessing the most elaborate coincidence in history or something truly supernatural was occurring. The rain began gently at first, but quickly intensified into the kind of downpour that the region had not seen in 7 months. As the life-giving water fell from the sky, the crowd erupted into cheers and songs of thanksgiving. The drought was breaking, and their shaman had demonstrated that the old ways still held power over the forces of nature. The miracle was complete, but Kumare's journey across the river was not yet finished. The rain that began to fall as Kumare reached the midpoint of his impossible journey was unlike any precipitation the assembled witnesses had experienced during the long months of drought. Each drop seemed to carry within it a concentrated essence of life itself, striking the parched earth with an almost musical quality that harmonized with the continuing chants of the shamans gathered on the shore. Zimmerman found himself torn between his desire to document this extraordinary event and his need to protect his camera equipment from the increasingly heavy downpour. The irony was not lost on him. He had come to record what he expected to be an interesting example of indigenous theater, only to find himself witnessing something that challenged the very foundations of his scientific worldview. As the rain intensified, the river began to rise, but rather than making Kumare's journey more difficult, the additional water seemed to strengthen whatever force was supporting him. The phosphorescent glow around his feet grew brighter, creating patterns in the water that resembled ancient script written in light itself. Elder Takak, despite his advanced age and the soaking rain, refused to be moved from his position of observation. Water streamed down his weathered face as he watched Kumare's progress with eyes that had seen nearly a century of life. But nothing quite like this. The spirits are writing their names in the water, he whispered to those huddled around his litter. Look closely, and you can see the signatures of the ancient ones who have not walked among us for generations beyond counting. Indeed, the patterns of light seemed to form symbols that flickered at the edge of comprehension, as if the very act of witnessing them was changing their nature. Several of the more purely sensitive individuals in the crowd began to report visions, glimpses of ancestral figures standing alongside Kumare on the water's surface, translucent forms that appear and disappear like memories made manifest. John Aritana wiped the rain from his eyes, struggling to maintain his view of the shaman's progress. The sight of Kumare walking steadily across the rising river had awakened something profound within him, a connection to his heritage that felt stronger than any doubt or modern skepticism. Father, he said to Chief Raoni, who stood beside him with rain streaming from his elaborate headdress, I understand now why the elders always spoke of the shamans with such reverence. This is not just magic, it is proof that our people are still connected to forces greater than ourselves. Chief Raoni nodded, his eyes never leaving the figure of Kumare as the shaman continued his methodical progress across the water. Your grandfather told me stories of such things when I was your age, he replied, his voice barely audible above the sound of falling rain. He always believed them to be metaphors, lessons wrapped in impossible ties. Now I see that some truths are too large for ordinary understanding. As Kumare approached the three-quarter point of his crossing, the spiritual intensity of the moment seemed to reach a crescendo. The rain was now falling in torrents, transforming the drought-stricken landscape into a symphony of rushing water and renewed life. The sacred fires, despite the downpour, continued to burn with flames that seemed immune to the natural laws that should have extinguished them. Zimmerman, his notebook now thoroughly soaked, and his camera protected beneath his rain jacket, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality. The evidence before his eyes was undeniable, yet it contradicted every scientific principle he had ever studied. The shaman was walking on water that was clearly liquid, supporting his full weight on a surface that should have been unable to bear even a fraction of his mass. The anthropologist's academic training demanded that he look for rational explanations, but his increasingly desperate mental search for hidden platforms, optical illusions, or mass hypnosis yielded nothing. The water was transparent, the riverbed clearly visible beneath Kumare's feet, and the gathering crowd included individuals from multiple villages who had no reason to participate in an elaborate deception. As the shaman neared the far shore, He paused once more and turned to address the assembled witnesses. The rain seemed to part around him, creating a column of relative dryness that allowed his voice to carry clearly across the water. "My people," he called out. His words somehow audible, despite the distance and the sound of falling rain. "What you witness today is not the power of one man, but the strength of a people who have maintained their connection to the same. The spirits do not respond to my faith alone, but to the collective belief of all who have gathered here." As if to emphasize his point, Kumare gestured toward the crowd, and several witnesses later swore they saw streams of light flowing from the assembled people toward the sun, connecting them all in a web of spiritual energy that was visible to those whose eyes had been opened by the miracle they were witnessing. The sight was so overwhelming that many in the crowd began to weep openly, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of connection to something larger than themselves. The drought had not merely been a physical challenge, it had been a spiritual test that had brought them together in a demonstration of faith that transcended individual doubt and fear. Kretire, who had begun the day as a skeptic influenced by modern ideas about the superiority of Western knowledge, found himself on his knees in the mud, overwhelmed by the reality of what he was witnessing. "He was wrong," he whispered, his words lost in the sound of rain, but somehow heard by those around him. "I thought the old ways were just stories told to children. I didn't understand that they were instructions for how to live in harmony with forces beyond our comprehension." As Kumare took his final steps toward the far shore, the phosphorescent glow around his feet began to spread outward, creating a path of light that stretched back across the water toward the assembled crowd. For a moment it seemed as if anyone with sufficient faith might be able to follow in the shaman's footsteps, walking across the surface of the river on a bridge made of pure spiritual energy. The temptation was strong, and several of the younger shamans present took tentative steps toward the water's edge, drawn by the possibility of sharing in this miraculous demonstration. But Elder Takak's voice cut through their enthusiasm with the authority of age and wisdom. "No," he called out, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his advanced years. "This is Kumare's journey, his demonstration of faith on behalf of all of us. To follow would be to diminish the gift he has given us. We are witnesses, not participants. Our role is to remember and to ensure that this day is never forgotten." The wisdom of the elder's words was immediately apparent, and those who had been moving toward the water stopped and returned to their positions as observers. This was indeed Kumare's moment, his offering to the spirits on behalf of his people, and to interfere would be to risk destroying the delicate balance that had made the miracle possible. As the shaman's feet finally touched the muddy bank on the far side of the river, the phosphorescent glow began to fade, and the water returned to its normal appearance. But the rain continued to fall, and the river continued to rise, bringing with it the promise of renewed life for the drought-stricken region. Kumare stood on the far shore for a moment, his arms raised in a gesture of thanksgiving that seemed to encompass not just the immediate miracle, but the entire relationship between his people and the spiritual forces that governed their world. Then, with the same measured pace he had used to cross the water, he began to walk along the riverbank toward a point where he could safely return to rejoin his people. The crowd, still processing what they had witnessed, began to move along the side of the river to meet him. The impossible had become reality. The sacred that had manifested in the physical world, and the drought that had threatened their very survival, was breaking in a downpour that promised to restore the natural balance of their homeland. Zimmerman, his scientific worldview forever altered by what he had witnessed, carefully protected his camera and notes as he joined the procession. He knew that when he eventually returned to civilization, his account of this day would be met with skepticism and disbelief. But he also knew that he had been privileged to witness something that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding, a demonstration of human potential that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. The journey back to the village became a procession of transformation, both literal and spiritual. As the crowd made their way through the rainforest, now alive with the sound of falling water and the grateful songs of countless creatures. The very landscape seemed to be awakening from a long, deathly sleep. Streams that had been reduced to cracked earth began to flow again, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with renewed vitality. Kumare walked among his people now, no longer the otherworldly figure who had defied the laws of physics on the river's surface, but somehow still carrying within him an aura of the sacred that made even the most casual observer aware that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. His magnificent address, though dampened by the rain, seemed to glow with an inner light that reflected the spiritual fire that burned within him. Dr. Zimmerman found himself walking beside Elder Takak's litter, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he had witnessed. The old man, despite his advanced age and the physical strain of the day's events, seemed energized by the miraculous demonstration he had observed. "You are troubled, white man?" Takak observed, his ancient eyes studying the anthropologist with surprising acuity. "Your mind seeks to understand what your heart has already accepted." Zimmerman nodded, grateful for the elder's perceptiveness. "In my world," he said carefully, "what we witnessed today would be considered impossible. My people believe that the laws of nature are fixed and unchangeable, that water cannot support a man's weight without some form of physical assistance." Takak smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features into something almost youthful. "Perhaps," he suggested, "your people have forgotten that the laws of nature are not chains that bind the world, but songs that describe its dance. And sometimes, when the music changes, the dance changes too." The wisdom in the elder's words struck Zimmerman with unexpected force. He had spent years studying indigenous cultures from the perspective of an outside observer, cataloging their beliefs and practices as curiosities to be analyzed and explained. But today had shown him that there were depths to these traditions that his academic training had never prepared him to understand. As they walked, the rain continued to fall with increasing intensity, transforming the forest around them into a cathedral of sound and motion. Waterfalls that had been silent for months began to sing again, and the great trees seemed to stretch their branches toward the sky in gestures of gratitude and celebration. Young Aritana walked near the front of the procession, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed. The demonstration of Kumare's power had not merely been a display of supernatural ability, it had been a profound statement about the nature of reality itself and his people's place within it. "The spirits have not abandoned us," he said to his father, Chief Raoni, as they navigated a particularly muddy section of the forest path. "They were waiting for us to remember who we are, to demonstrate that we still honor the ancient covenants." Chief Raoni nodded thoughtfully. The day's events had given him much to consider, not just as a leader but as a guardian of his people's spiritual heritage. The increasing contact with the outside world had brought both opportunities and challenges, and he had often wondered whether the old ways could survive in a rapidly changing world. "Today's shown us that the old ways are not relics of the past," he replied, "but living traditions that can still guide us through the challenges of the present. Kumare has reminded us that our ancestors' wisdom was not superstition, but a deeper understanding of the world's true nature." As the procession continued through the rain-soaked forest, word of the miracle began to spread beyond the immediate witnesses. Runners were dispatched to distant villages, carrying news of the shaman's water walking and the breaking of the drought. The story would travel through the complex network of indigenous communication, reaching communities throughout the Amazon Basin and beyond. Dr. Zimmerman knew that his own account of the day's events would face a very different reception when he eventually returned to the academic world. The photographs in his camera, if they had captured anything at all, would be dismissed as hoaxes or optical illusions. His written observations would be attributed to cultural bias or temporary psychological disturbance brought on by exposure to exotic plants and unfamiliar rituals. Yet he also knew that he had been forever changed by what he had witnessed. The rigid boundaries between possible and impossible that had defined his worldview had been shattered, replaced by a more fluid understanding of reality. that acknowledged the existence of forces beyond conventional scientific measurement. As they neared the villages, the sound of celebration began to reach their ears. Those who had remained behind, the elderly, the infirm, and the very young, had felt the rain begin and understood its significance. The drought was breaking, and their shaman had succeeded in his impossible task. The village itself had been transformed by the downpour. The central plaza, which had been a dusty expanse of cracked earth that morning, was now a shallow lake reflecting the joy-filled faces of the returning crowd. Children splashed in the puddles with abandon, their laughter mixing with the songs of thanksgiving that rose from every corner of the community. Kumare was greeted as a hero, but he deflected the praise with characteristic humility. He was merely the instrument, he insisted as the crowd gathered around him in the village center. The power belonged to all of us, to our collective faith and our willingness to honor the ancient ways. The spirits responded not to my individual strength, but to the unity of our people. As the celebration continued into the evening, Dr. Zimmerman found himself in the unique position of being both participant and observer. The anthropologist wanted to document every detail of the post-ritual festivities, but the human being who had witnessed the miracle simply wanted to be present in the moment, to absorb the profound sense of community and spiritual connection that permeated the gathering. The rain continued throughout the night, a steady drumbeat of renewal that seemed to wash away not just the physical effects of the drought, but the spiritual malaise that had settled over the region. By morning, the Singu River had risen to levels not seen in months, and the forest was alive with the sounds of creatures celebrating the return of life-giving water. Elder Takak, despite his advanced age, insisted on being carried to the riverbank to witness the transformation. The sight of the flowing water, clear and strong once again, brought tears to his ancient eyes. "I have lived to see the spirits dance upon the water," he whispered to those gathered around him. "I have witnessed the impossible become reality through the power of faith. My long life has been blessed with this gift, and I can depart this world knowing that the sacred traditions of our people remain strong." His words proved prophetic. 3 days later, as the village continued its celebration of the drought's end and the demonstration of their spiritual heritage's enduring power, Elder Takak passed peacefully in his sleep and smile on his weathered face and his hand clutching a small piece of river stone that had been blessed by Kumare during the water-walking ceremony. The old man's death was not mourned as a tragedy but celebrated as the completion of a life that had been granted the extraordinary privilege of witnessing one of the most significant spiritual events in Kayapo history. His passing seemed to mark the end of one chapter in the tribe's story and the beginning of another, one in which the ancient wisdom would be carried forward by a new generation that had seen firsthand the power of their ancestral tradition. 5 years had passed since the day Kumare walked across the waters of the Singu River, and the story had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the boundaries of Kayapo territory. The tales had been carried by traders, missionaries, and explorers throughout the Amazon Basin and beyond, growing in the telling until it had become part of the larger mythology of the rainforest itself. Hendrik Zimmerman had returned to Germany in 1934, his academic career forever altered by what he had witnessed in the depths of the Amazon. His initial attempts to publish his account of the water-walking ceremony had been met with skepticism and ridicule from his colleagues at the Berlin Museum of Ethnology. The photographs he had taken, while clear and detailed, were dismissed as clever hoaxes or the products of primitive photographic techniques combined with favorable lighting conditions. Undeterred by the academic establishment's rejection of his most extraordinary findings, Zimmerman had begun writing a book that would challenge the very foundations of Western understanding about the nature of reality and the capabilities of human consciousness. Walking on Water, a scientist's journey into the heart of the impossible, would not be published until after the war, but it would eventually become a seminal work in the emerging field of consciousness studies. In the village of Metuktire, Life had returned to a rhythm that honored both ancient traditions and the realities of an increasingly connected world. The drought end had brought more than just physical relief. It had renewed the community's confidence in their spiritual heritage and their place in the larger cosmos. Chief Raoni now showing the first signs of the age that would eventually lead him to pass leadership to his son. Aritana often reflected on the changes that had swept through their world since that miraculous day. The outside world continued to encroach upon their territory, bringing both opportunities and challenges that required careful navigation. The water walking was not just a demonstration of Kumare's power. He would tell visitors who came seeking to understand the significance of the event. It was a reminder that our people possessed knowledge and capabilities that the modern world has forgotten. We must find ways to preserve this wisdom while adapting to the changes that surround us. Aritana, now 24 and being groomed for leadership, had taken the lessons of that day to heart. He had begun working with anthropologists and documentary filmmakers to create a record of Kayapo traditions that would preserve their knowledge for future generations, while maintaining the sacred nature of their most important ceremonies. Some things must be shared so they will not be lost, he explained to the tribal council during one of their regular meetings. But other things must be protected so they will not be diminished. The challenge is knowing which is which. Kumare himself had aged visibly in the years since the water walking, though whether this was due to the passage of time or the spiritual toll of his extraordinary demonstration was unclear. He had become even more reclusive, spending long periods in meditation and communion with the spirit world, emerging only when the community faced challenges that required his unique abilities. The shaman's dwelling had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by indigenous people from throughout the Amazon who sought his blessing or guidance. He received these visitors with patience and wisdom, but he rarely spoke of the day he had walked on waters, preferring to focus on the practical applications of spiritual knowledge in daily life. The miracle was not the walking, he would tell those who pressed him for details about the ceremony. The miracle was the remembering, the moment when our people recalled who they truly are, and what they are capable of when they align themselves with the sacred forces that govern all existence. The story of the water walking had also reached the attention of researchers and spiritual seekers from around the world. A small but steady stream of visitors began making the difficult journey into Kayapo territory, hoping to witness similar demonstrations or to learn the secrets of indigenous shamanic practice. Most of these visitors were disappointed. Kumare had made it clear that the water walking had been a specific response to a particular crisis, not a performance to be repeated for the entertainment of outsiders. The spiritual conditions that had made the miracle possible, the community's desperate need, their collective faith, and the alignment of natural and supernatural forces could not be artificially recreated. You seek to see the impossible, he told one group of Western spiritual seekers who had traveled thousands of miles to reach his village. But you have not prepared your hearts to understand what the impossible truly means. He is not magic performed for amusement, but the natural result of living in harmony with forces greater than ourselves. Some visitors left disappointed, but others found in Kumare's teachings a depth of wisdom that transformed their understanding of spirituality and human potential. A few remained in the region for extended periods, studying with the shaman and other Kayapo elders in an attempt to bridge the gap between indigenous wisdom and modern consciousness. Among these long-term students was Dr. Chen, a neuroscientist from the University of California who had first heard about the water walking through Zimmerman's underground writings. She had arrived in 1937 with sophisticated equipment designed to measure brain activity and electromagnetic fields, hoping to find scientific explanations for shamanic abilities. What she discovered instead was that the most profound aspects of indigenous spiritual practice existed beyond the reach of her instrument. The changes in consciousness that occurred during deep shamanic states involved dimensions of human experience that could not be quantified or measured by conventional scientific methods. I came here looking for proof, she wrote in her journal after 6 months of study with Kumare. What I found instead was a different way of understanding what proof means. The shaman's abilities are not supernatural. They are natural capabilities that our culture has forgotten how to access. Dochien's work would eventually contribute to a new understanding of human consciousness that acknowledged the existence of abilities and perceptions that lay dormant in most people, but could be awakened through proper training and spiritual development. Her collaboration with Kumare would span nearly a decade and result in groundbreaking research that would influence fields ranging from psychology to quantum physics. As the Indigenous train thus drew to a close, the world beyond the Amazon was heading toward a global conflict that would reshape human civilization. But in the heart of the rainforest, the Kayapo people continued to live according to rhythms and principles that had sustained them for countless generations. The story of Kumare's water walking had become more than just a tale of miraculous events. It had become a symbol of the enduring power of indigenous wisdom and the human capacity to transcend apparent limitations through faith, community, and connection to the sacred. On Kieteimined, when the village gathered around the central fire to share stories and songs, the elders would sometimes speak of that extraordinary day when their shaman had walked upon the waters and brought the rains back to their drought-stricken land. The children would listen with wide eyes, absorbing not just the details of the miracle, but the deeper lessons it contained about courage, faith, and the importance of maintaining their connection to the spiritual forces that governed their world. Will we ever see such things again? The children would ask, and the elders would smile and reply, the spirits are always present, always ready to respond to those who approach them with pure hearts and genuine need. The question is not whether miracles are possible, but whether we are prepared to recognize them when they occur. As the years passed and the story spread, it would inspire countless others to seek their own connections to the sacred, to explore the boundaries between possible and impossible, and to remember that human beings are capable of far more than the modern world typically acknowledges. The legacy of Kumare's water walking would endure long after the participants in that extraordinary day had passed into legend themselves, serving as a reminder that the most profound truths about human nature and the cosmos often exist beyond the reach of conventional understanding, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave enough to walk upon the waters of faith. In the end, the miracle was not just that a man had walked on water, but that a community had remembered its connection to the infinite, and in doing so had opened a doorway between worlds that would never fully close again. Heinrich Zimmermann's book, Walking on Water, A Scientist's Journey into the Heart of the Impossible, was finally published in 1922, 7 years after the end of World War II. By then, the world was ready for new ways of thinking about consciousness and human potential. The book became an underground classic, inspiring a generation of researchers to explore the intersection between science and spirituality. The photographs Zimmermann had taken that day in 1933 were eventually authenticated by multiple independent experts, though they remained controversial throughout his lifetime. Today, they are housed in the Smithsonian Institution's collection of unexplained phenomena, continuing to challenge viewers to expand their understanding of what is possible. Kumare lived until 1967, passing away at the age of 77 during a ceremony designed to ensure the continuation of his spiritual lineage. His final words, according to those present, were, "The water remembers, the spirits remember, and now you must remember for them." The Kayapo people continue to inhabit their ancestral lands in the Amazon Basin, maintaining their traditions while adapting to the challenges of the modern world. The story of the shaman who walked on water remains central to their oral history, a reminder of their people's extraordinary spiritual heritage and their ongoing connection to forces beyond ordinary understanding. The Singwe River still flows through their territory, carrying with it the memory of that impossible day when faith became physics and the sacred manifested in the realm of the everyday, proving once again that the boundaries between worlds are far more permeable than most people dare to imagine.